Well, here I am in a basement in Aurora, Illinois, coming to you with what's called The Exchange with Ed Stetzer. We actually had a debate about what to call this. There were a series of names that were suggested. My personal favorite was Issues with Ed, and there was a long stream of people who would affirm that to be the case. But this is a new idea for us. One of the things that we're trying to do is to better connect with pastors and church leaders. And let me share with you a little bit about the purpose of what we're doing, and then we're going to jump into kind of our format and our dialogue that we're having today. We are live, and you can log on. There's a chat box there. You can chat and share information there. We are going to kind of build this around some themes and some topics as well. And so I'm going to give those in just a few minutes, and then we'll open up the questions around those themes and topics. And there will be some future shows that we'll do just kind of a random Q&A as well, but got some things we want to talk about here as well. And so my name is Ed Stetzer, and I'm the president of Lifeway Research. And again, this is called The Exchange. The purpose here is, I love pastors and church leaders. That's my passion, is to help pastors and church leaders to engage God's mission, to be faithful in that, and to provoke one another to love and good deeds. Too often, I'm just kind of a motivational speaker who lives in a van down by the river, and I just go around and I speak at conferences, and hopefully I encourage pastors and leaders. But one of the things that is often missing, is often lacking, and part of what I have a desire for is really to have a sense where we can ask questions and have dialogue and talk around some issues. Well, why? Because sometimes people have more questions. They want to follow up. They've heard something and they need some clarity, and that's what the purpose of what we're going to be doing here today and in the future. It is an experiment. It's just something we're beginning and we're trying. And if it's helpful, great. If it's not helpful, then okay. But ultimately, our desire is that we might provoke one another to love and good deeds and help pastors and church leaders as they think more deeply about the gospel, God's mission, how His name and His fame might be more widely known. Let me share with you some of the format things that we're going to do. As you can see, we're doing it from a studio. We've got a setup here, and the folks at Lifeway have graciously set it up so that we can kind of have this communication medium. And I do want to thank. I mean, we have a team of people here that are working to make this possible, to make this happen. So we'll do it each time from here. And yes, I'll still say I'm probably broadcasting from a basement in Aurora, Illinois, but I'm really not. But the format will be kind of around some discussions. Of questions. And matter of fact, today we'll talk about several things, and I've got some of these things here. There's been a lot of discussion about the Christianity Today article that I recently wrote. I'm going to share some about that and how do we discern good religious research from bad religious research, and we'll look at that in just a little bit. Also, something I've written about on the issue of what I call clergification. We'll unpack that a little bit as well. And then today also we're going to talk some about the missional church and its need to, like on all conversation, to be engaged in the proclamation of the gospel. You know, part of the central to being on mission is to be faithful to Jesus' mission, and He came to serve the hurting in Luke 4, but in Luke 19:10 He says, I came to seek and save the lost. And we never want to lose the incredible importance of the proclamation of the gospel to men and women. And so those will be kind of the focal areas that we look at today, and every show will have one or more focal areas. For example, coming up, we're going to do one on church planting, and we'll talk some about the church planting ideas that are out there. Also, probably we'll do this around, I have a new book coming out with Warren Bird called Viral Churches, How Church Planters Can Become Movement Makers, looking at how church planting can have a bigger impact. Also, we'll look at church revitalization along the way as well. And you kind of unpack the issue of church revitalization. And this is a huge issue for me. I love church planters. Many of you church planters know that. And we've had the chance to connect, and we'll connect at conferences and other places along the way. But I think also, too, we all need to love churches, established churches. Sometimes they get swept aside in the conversation, and it matters deeply that established churches that want to be faithful. I sometimes think that we just want to brush them aside. Well, they can't be revitalized. They can't be missional. They can't do this. And I think that's all wrong. I think that's prideful on our part. And one of the reasons we wrote Comeback Churches is to share about that. And I'll share some of the ideas about church revitalization that I think are essential for us to get unpacked. And also too, you may want to make suggestions as well. Maybe you want to say, I'd like to make some suggestions on what could could talk about. Matter of fact, let me encourage you to do that. As I kind of lay out some of these ideas, if you want to put some suggestions in the chat box, you feel free to do that. Now, this will be archived later. If you're watching an archived copy, you can't do that. But, suggest some of these things, and we'll note these things and talk about them a little bit later on as we go. And so, with that being said, let's jump in. Let's talk about some of the issues that are here that we can unpack over the course of our show. Oh, by the way, I should say we'll do this about 30 minutes each time that we do it, and then we'll archive the show, and it'll be available on different mediums like Vimeo and other contexts as well. So let me start by taking a look a little bit at this. This is from Christianity Today, and this article is they put it the description of such on the cover, and it researches some important things that come up, and I want to unpack some of those. I see we already have a question from here in the box, and I'm going to talk some about that in a bit. It's a good question from Philip, and he asked, in regards to good religious research, is quantitative research better than qualitative? We're going to unpack that. Let me talk some about the issues of research that we can get a picture of. In here, the article I began with by citing some statistics that probably you've heard. Here are a few of the statistics that are often cited, that are often out there. Let me share a couple of them with you. For example, one that I've heard lots of times is that 94% of evangelical youth drop out of church after high school, never to return. I've seen that statistic all over the place. I was speaking to a group of youth pastors, student pastors in Chattanooga, at the Chattanooga Convention Center on Friday at something called Conclave. And I mentioned that statistic, and I said, how many of you heard that? And people just raised their hands all over the different conversations. And I said, I'm not going to throw the people under the bus who have publicized that statistic. And I'm glad I didn't, because the person who came up afterwards said, we put it on a video and sent it out to 1,000+ people. He came up afterwards and said, we know that's not a correct statistic now. So that's not accurate. The statistic that we often hear, 94% and others, they come from, they're often quoted. Let me give you another one. 4% of this generation is Christian, someone has said. Well, what happens is these statistics sort of get out there and they grow, and they're not necessarily accurate statistics. And if you listen to some people, the way they speak of the church, it's as if the last young adult has walked to the edge of town and joined a Wiccan coven worshiping the moon and has left the church. And I don't think the statistics will accurately say that. And matter of fact, on the issue of young adults, as an issue I'm passionate about, I wrote a book on the subject, and I guess when I quote that, I'm not selling books or anything. I don't make any money off Lost and Found or anything of that sort. But the book is Lost and Found, and in there, one of the things we did, and we updated it here in the Christianity Today article. One of the things we did is we got a picture of kind of where young adults are, what percentage of young adults are in church, and what we find is that there is a decline among congregational attendance of young adults. And that decline goes back over several decades. It's a decline, but among evangelicals, it's not nearly the decline it is among congregations as a whole. Congregations could include mainline denominational churches. It might include Jewish synagogues. It might include mosques. Congregations is a broad category. And we looked at the General Social Survey, which is probably the second most widely quoted source of data behind the Census Bureau. And when we look at that, the picture we get is that among evangelicals, young adult attendance is not dissimilar to where it was several decades ago. Now, there are some concerns, and I think those concerns really do matter. But I think that the issue is how do we find those right statistics? One of the people asked the question, how do we know what sources are good statistics and what are inaccurate? Here's a key way to do it. One of the ways that you do it is you look if they give information about how they ask the question. If you hear somebody say that 195 million Americans are unchurched, which is a statistic I cite in here, that's an incorrect statistic that actually came from an office that I used to run, but has been misquoted many, many times. Well, you have to ask, well, how did you come to that conclusion? So I'd encourage you, when you look at statistics, to say, what's the methodology? If someone's quoting a statistic and doesn't release the methodology, well, sometimes they're quoting somebody else. Whenever we release statistics at Lifeway Research, we always release the methodology. Now, we're unapologetic that we have a desire. Our desire at Lifeway Research is to assist churches and Christians to better understand the church and culture for more effective gospel impact. So when we do research, we're beginning with that in mind. Sometimes we find things that are out of our preference, that are out of what we believe. But we report them. We believe that facts are our friends. Matter of fact, when we did the research for Lost and Found, we found that 2 out of 3 young adults, unchurched young adults who haven't been to church, synagogue, or mosque for anything other than a wedding, holiday, or funeral for 6 months, 2 out of 3 said the church is full of hypocrites, people who do one thing and say another. About 3 out of 4 said is that that organized religion, or Christianity today, is more about organized religion than loving God and loving others. I mean, those are not happy statistics. I was asked to go on CNN to talk about these statistics, and a funny story, you can see this on YouTube. If you look at the YouTube interview, Mike Galanagos interviews me until we talk about the research, all the graphics on there ask questions, and it says, the main graphic is attacks on Christians. When we released this data, they thought we were an anti-Christian organization releasing this data and wanted to talk to us about it. And they didn't have time to change the graphics. Well, facts are our friends. We're going to talk about these things. And one of the things I wanted to talk about on CNN is I got to talk about the stumbling block of the cross. But I also said too many people are tripping on the stumbling block of the church before they get to the stumbling block of the cross. And so releasing your methodology is essential. Also, too, sometimes something can be accurate but then misunderstood. If I do a convenience sample, or if I do an online poll of my readers, I mean, those are all helpful information. If I find out that Time Magazine does a poll of their readers, that is an accurate statement of the beliefs of Time Magazine's readers who responded to the poll on the internet. The difficulty is you can't take that and then generalize it and say all Americans say or all Americans believe. And so getting the methodology matters, understanding some of the background gets a picture of that as well. But one of the things we looked at was to kind of get a picture of what the research said. And let me just say in the big picture that Christianity Today headlined the article well. And the title of the article that kind of headlined and the picture that we got was real simple. It's Chicken Little Was Wrong. Now, I am one who has been very clear in communicating and articulating a concern about a need for change and transformation in the church. I believe that with all of my heart. But I think that when we overstate the situation, crises sell books, but they don't fix problems. And so there are issues, there are concerns. We wrote about that among young adults in Lost and Found and others. But what we wanted to look at is what's the state of the church? Well, let's talk about it some. I think we can get a couple of pictures along the way. And let me address some questions that address that. Someone asked, is the decline of young adults from moving from one denomination to another denomination? And that's a great question. That's a great question. The answer is there is some growth, and I'm actually going to release a study on this, and it's not released yet, but I'm going to release a study on this. There is some transition from young adults from denominational contexts, I'm identified with a denominational church, to non-denominational contexts. And that's not just among young adults, but among people in general. And so we're going to address that. And so that'll probably be released. We're just finishing up the data on that. That'll probably be released this May. I'm going to be writing an article, again in Christianity Today, that'll address some of that in the area of denominations and kind of unpack some of that along as we go. But again, what I would say is that there's challenges out there. Young adults are distrustful often of the church. My friend Dan Kimball wrote a book called They Like Jesus, but Not the Church. And of course, the Jesus they like is kind of a Jesus they've created in their own image. But I think ultimately there's truth to that statement, and we need to address it. But let's look at a broad picture of where the church is. Here's some things. I think many of you watching will be in mainline denominational context. I think it's what we call the seven sisters of the mainline, right? The main seven mainline denominations. They're hemorrhaging. The decline there right now, many of them are trying to manage their decline as that decline continues. In some cases, accelerates. Among evangelicals, there is, I would say evangelicals, with the exception of Pentecostals, evangelicals are holding their own. Maybe, depending upon who you look at, some of the denominations are declining. One of the statistics is that we cited in the article was that of the 25 faith groups, I can't call them all denominations because there are a couple of them that would be sects that would be outside of our historic understanding of Christianity, not really denominations. But of the 25, only 2 would be within the realm of historic Christian denominations. And of the 2 of those, they were both Pentecostal that were growing. That's the Church of God, Cleveland, Tennessee, and the Assemblies of God. And I bet we have some Assemblies of God in Cleveland, Church of God Cleveland folks who are here watching in the chat room. And so those are the 2 that were growing. And the other two that were growing, by the way, just for full disclosure, were the Mormons, the Church of Jesus Christ and Latter-day Saints, and the Jehovah's Witnesses. And so of those, there were two historic Christian denominations that were growing. The other top 25 were declining. And some of those are evangelical, some of those are mainline. So what you find is mainline's experiencing some hemorrhage. The evangelicals holding their own but struggling in some places. But then Pentecostals experiencing growth. And not the robust growth, that of what was there. I think part of the reason is, and one of the questions that someone's asked, I think it's a good question, is why Pentecostals are growing and why other groups are not. And I think that's a fair question. I think one of the reasons is there's a fervency that's there that evangelicals as a whole need, is that there's something transformative that they want to share and they want to tell about with others. And I think evangelicals need that. I think all kinds of groups need that along the way. And so that's kind of a broad picture. Let me take another question here. What is the biggest or scariest statistic in Lost and Found, and what hit you hardest in that study, somebody asks? The biggest and scariest statistic. I think for me, let me give that, and then let me give the most encouraging one. And unpack them a couple along the way. Matter of fact, I'm going to pull it up while we're talking, because I want to make sure that I give you the accurate numbers along the way. And so I'm pulling it up here on my trusty Mac, and I just was looking for an opportunity to do that and to get a picture of this. Let me share with you some of the statistics from the Lost and Found book. The subtitle is "The Younger Unchurched and Churches That Reach Them." Here, some of the more scary statistics to me were these. I mentioned the church is full of hypocrites. Another one is that 90% of them say, I believe I can have a good relationship with God without being involved in a church. Now, keeping in mind these are unchurched people, so they've made a choice, but my hope is that and it was an unrealized hope, was that they would see the church as a vital part of their spiritual journey. I think the rapidly growing category, is the category of spiritual but not religious. We actually look at that in Lost and Found. There's 4 categories: spiritual but not religious, and that's a growing category. There were a lot of people who said they were religious but not spiritual, and I don't want to meet those people. But they're religious but not spiritual. Some were neither spiritual nor religious, but there's a growing category there, and I think we see that to be common. Another one that I think was interesting to me was, and this is the one that I ended up talking about a little bit on the CNN presentation, was the Christians get on my nerves. And 46% of young adults who are unchurched, and 44% of 30 or above unchurched, right? The older unchurched, though I know if you're 31, you don't see yourself as older, but just for the categories. 40 to 46% said that Christians get on my nerves. I can't imagine that 44 to 46% of people, of random unchurched Americans, would say that Jews get on my nerves, or that or Latinos get on my nerves. And I think that there's a sense, now to be fair, part of the reason for that is that people see Christians as the majority, and people often feel more willing to speak to groups that are enfranchised rather than disenfranchised, and I do get that. But it concerns me that a strong minority, not quite half, but a strong minority, we're willing to say Christians get on my nerves. But let me say, too, that there are some things that, to me, are very encouraging along the way. And let me unpack some of that. Here's one. We asked, if somebody wanted to tell me what she or he believed about Christianity, I'd be willing to listen. 90% of the younger unchurched, 89%, but round up to 90, said that was the case. And 75% of the older unchurched, the 30 or above, said that was the case. So 9 out of 10, 3 out of 4. So there's an openness that's there. I'd be willing to study the Bible if a friend asked me to. Among the younger unchurched, it was a majority said that, 61%. Among the older unchurched, it was 42%. And we have a good question. Someone asked the question about how does this look like in urban areas? How is this different in urban context? Here's one thing you'll find is we did a random sample of all Americans, all the methodologies there in the book, but let me just real quickly say it to you. We did 1,000. We did 900 Americans, 100 Canadians. I try to include Canadians as much as we can in research. I think sometimes we forget that there's a robust need for mission and ministry in the Canadian context. My wife's Canadian, just full disclosure. And so 1,000 young adults, and then we compared them to 500 30 plus, so we could have some comparisons between the two. And so, but for me, I see some encouragement is that we see this picture of people willing to have this conversation along the way. So we look at research. Let me see if there are a couple more questions that I should address. Someone asked, is there a correlation between Mac users and growing churches? Yes, a very clear correlation. And ironically, if I mentioned Lost and Found a lot, if you read Lost and Found, I make fun of Mac users and then call them a cult. And then I ironically have now joined the cult since Lost and Found was published. But more important question, how is growth defined in terms of denominations? That's a great question. Pretty much the standard that statisticians use, that we see in the handbook of denominations and others, is membership. And so the membership from year to year. Now, the reason is that just tends to be something that people use universally. So it's not perfect. There are ways that you'd probably not want to do those things, but kind of a picture along the way is we look at membership in denominations as well. All right, let's take a look at some of the other things that we talked about along the way, and I just want to unpack them a bit as we talk about these things. Continue to send questions that you have. Use the hash mark the exchange, and you can put them up over Twitter. So I want to encourage you to do that. Some other things I want to share with you is an article that I just discussed a bit. An article that I'm working on for Your Church magazine. It's going to be in the next issue, in the May-June issue. And one of the things I talk about in that project is clergification. That's not a real word. That's a word I made up. I make up words sometimes. Forgive me. But in clergification is the idea that is very prevalent in the church that that there's a certain class of people, a certain hierarchy, maybe you say a priesthood, if you will, that does the work of the ministry, and the job of the normal people is to pay, pray, and get out of the way. And so they pray for their pastors. Now, I want you to know that, many of you know me, would know this, but if you're watching this for the first time, I am pro-pastor. I love pastors. I think pastors get just too much beat on. I'm not saying everyone's a perfect pastor, but I love pastors. But what I would say is clergification is it's a strong phenomenon in the church today, churches all across the world. And to me, most Protestant, most evangelical, but Protestant in general, most churches look more like pre-Reformation Roman Catholic churches than they do like churches that have an empowered priesthood of the believers. We think about, the Scripture talks about that you are a holy nation, a royal priesthood, and yet we don't see people acting like that. Now, they don't say that. They would stand up and say, we believe we have direct access to the Father through Christ, and they might reject ideas of the need for an intermediary theologically. But it's remarkable to me that so many churches look like pre-Reformation Roman Catholic churches where there's a priestly class and then there's a people who are unengaged in mission and ministry. And I'm concerned about that. And so I'm writing some about that. And the article is coming out, and it's debunking the clergification myth, and is what we're going to be talking about as we kind of unpack it. Now, why do pastors get there? Well, a lot of it has to do with our culture. In our culture, if you're sick, you go to a doctor. If you need legal help, you go to a lawyer. If your car's broken down, you go to a mechanic. And if you need spiritual help, you go to a pastor, a professional clergy member. And what I would say is that we're teaching people that they need us more than God wants them to believe they need us. Now, please hear this. Churches need pastors. I believe theologically that there are two biblical offices in the church, right? Pastor elders are one and deacons are the other. And I believe that to be the case. In churches, that's a part of the normative practice of New Testament Christianity. And I believe that. But what I would say is somehow we have to stop letting them believe, and maybe us acting as if we believe that our role is to do the work of the ministry. And it's in our language. How many times have you said, I'm as a pastor, and most of you are probably pastors who are watching this, not all, but have you said, I'm called to the ministry? Well, when you say that, you're really unintentionally devaluing the fact that all God's people are called to ministry. 1 Peter 4:10 says, as each one has received a special gift, use it to minister to one another as good stewards of the manifold grace of God. So the banker in my church, the homeless person in my church, whoever it is, they're all called to the ministry if they name the name of Jesus Christ. They're also sent on mission. John 20:21, speaking to the disciples and by extension to us, Jesus says, as the Father has sent me, so send I you. So God's people are called to the ministry and sent on mission, Our job as pastors, and I think of myself as a pastor, I try to consistently be serving in a church as I am now. Our job as pastors is laid out in Ephesians 4 to equip God's people for works of ministry to the building up of the body of Christ. So we don't, now there's some fear. Some will have some fear. Well, we don't want to devalue the role of the pastor. But instead, we want to make sure that the role of the pastor is valued and celebrated. And I get that. But what I want to say to you is that the role of the pastor is to be equipping, and that's important, and much more than that, preaching the Word of God, teaching, protecting the flock, all of those things matter. Now, are there churches, we have someone asking, are there churches doing a good job of declergifying, and what are they doing? Yes. And we're actually, I'm giving some examples. The editor there, Matt, at your churches, he says, he asked that very question, what are examples that we can give? And those are the churches that are really unleashing people for mission and ministry. And I think they're doing it in a few ways. Let me share a few of them. First of all, they're moving from the idea from Superman to everyone. So, in other words, it's not just this one miraculous figure who's moving forward and saving the church. I try to tell people all the time, I don't have a white horse. You know, if I'm a pastor, I don't have a white horse. Jesus will come back and he'll reign and you know, and it's his reign that matters. And so I'm making that transition from Superman to everyone. Another thing, Pastor, you can do is make Jesus the hero, not yourself the hero. If every story you tell or every moment, that key moment in the church is you were there and you helped lead that transition, or that was that key moment and you were a part of that and you share that, what happens is that begins people to think that you're the key to the church and you're preaching. Help them to leave to say, not what a great communicator, help them to leave and say, what a great Christ. Make Jesus the hero. And so I think those transitions help us to think differently about the way that we do church, to be focused. Now, pastors and church leaders, most of you who watch this will be pastors and church leaders. I want to encourage you to join him on mission by modeling that. By not buying into the clergification myth. I still remember at a church I served, a young couple came up to me and they had little Johnny, 8-year-old little Johnny, and they wanted me to talk to little Johnny because Johnny wanted to pray to receive Christ, but he had some questions. And I said no. And I know many think, what? Well, the reason I said no is I said, why don't you talk to Johnny? I mean, I could talk to Johnny, and to be honest, if I would have talked to Johnny, I would have answered Johnny's questions, and maybe I pray and I trust that Johnny would have received Christ, and they would have gone around and told all their friends how wonderful Ed was, and it would have been great for my reputation. But what I said to them instead was, no, you don't want me to do it. You should talk to him. What an opportunity for you to share. And they said, but he has questions. And I said, but he's 8. I mean, how hard can they be? I mean, is he struggling with the ontological arguments for the existence of God or building a view of theodicy? I mean, he wants to know how a big Jesus can fit in his little heart. And so they went away a little bit irritated with me, but they went home and when they talked to Johnny, that's not his real name, they talked to him and they answered his questions, and he did pray to trust Christ. And they came back to me a few weeks later and they thanked me. They said, thank you for not doing that. Now, the whole day, they probably said, oh, this Stetzer's this or Stetzer's that. But they came back to me later and said, thank you, because we had the privilege of asking our son. We were afraid to, but you helped us to do it. And here's what it is. When we do for people what God calls them to do, everybody gets hurt and the mission of God is hindered. Let me say it again so you don't miss it. When we do for people what God has called them to do, everybody gets hurt and the mission of God gets hindered. And so I think ultimately part of it is we're going to have to break the cycle of codependence where we're the ones who do it, and they're the ones who watch, and it's so many things point to that. You know, I've been, even the way we design our buildings, and I'm not. I mean, how else do you design buildings? I get that. I get that there are seats. I'm not making a statement about architecture, but I'm making a statement about the unintended side effect. Even of how we design our buildings, we basically have a stage where people do ministry, and the stands where people watch like spectators, lined up in rows like shelves at Walmart, facing forward, watching the ministry done. What I'd say is we've got to get people from sitting in rows to sitting in circles to going out and changing the world for the gospel. So I think in doing so, let me talk about some questions. The question is, does clergification increase the longer a church exists? And I think the answer is yes. I think new churches, I've had the privilege of planning several new churches, they tend to have kind of an all hands on deck mentality because they have to. I think over time, we become more reliant on paid staff. We become more reliant on our facilities. We have more along the way. And so I think it's essential for us I actually use a metaphor to describe this frequently. And the way I describe it is like, think of a yo-yo. And you spin a yo-yo around, and there are two forces at work. One pushing the yo-yo out. That's what we often call the centrifugal force. It's more than that. It's inertia, other things. But there's one pushing the yo-yo out on a string if you spin it around, and the other pulling it in. That's the centripetal force, and it's being exercised by the string. And every church, whether it's a house church where somebody sets up chairs and has cookies, somebody's holding the string. Somebody's holding it and letting the string out so the mission can increase and make a bigger impact. And as a church gets bigger, perhaps the distance and the involvement, because there's more people now, can grow. But what happens is over time, that string, which should be letting the ministry and the mission out, the further the mission and going outward, that string becomes thicker and thicker because I was supporting a bigger thing. Now, in the simplest church, we had someone set up the cookies. Now we have to have somebody, plan the music, and then we have to have somebody, plan the small groups. And so what happens is, as that grows and grows and grows, the string gets thicker. The problem is that eventually the focus of the ministry becomes the string. And I've been with so many large churches, and they say, Ed, we spend all the time just trying to service the machine, and we've lost focus on the mission. So what I would say is you may have to simplify that. My friend Tom Rainer and Eric Geiger have written a book called Simple Church that talks about that, to simplify that, to get that down, where the string is to serve the mission, the advance of the mission, so that God's name and fame will be more widely known, so that our church can be involved in what I think every missional church should be. It should be serving locally, planting nationally, and engaging an unreached people group globally. Well, we've kind of come to the time when we're out, and I'm not liking that. I just feel like we were just getting started, but we've kind of come to the time when we need to wrap. That article will be in a forthcoming Your Church magazine, and I want to encourage you to take a look at that as well. The one thing we didn't get to unpack, several things, and we'll unpack those a little bit later on. And so let me just encourage you before we go, that I do believe with all my heart that God is doing wonderful things in wonderful churches. I recognize that if you're a pastor and a church leader, and about 70 or 80% of American churches are plateaued or declining, I don't have the Canadian statistics, but they might not be dissimilar to that, then you may be in a church that's struggling. As we close today, I want to say to you that God is at work through the church. He loves the church. Galatians, Scripture in many places, but let me quote Ephesians 3:10. God has chosen the church to make known His manifold wisdom. It's His tool, it's His instrument, it's His vessel. The kingdom of God's bigger than the church, but God's working through the church for the kingdom impact. Don't give up, be encouraged, and I'll see you next time on The Exchange with Ed Stetzer. Thanks.